Welcome to the She Said Privacy, He Said Security podcast. Like any good marriage, we will debate, evaluate, and sometimes quarrel about how privacy and security impact business in the 21st century.
Hi, Jody Daniels here. I'm the founder and CEO of Red Clover Advisors, a certified women's privacy consultancy. I'm a privacy consultant and certified informational privacy professional providing practical privacy advice to overwhelmed companies.
Hello, Justin Daniels here. I am a shareholder at the law firm Baker Donaldson, and I am a corporate M&A and tech transaction attorney. I am passionate about helping companies solve complex cyber and privacy challenges during the life cycle of their business. I am the cyber quarterback, helping clients design and implement cyber plans, as well as help them manage and recover from data breaches.
This episode is brought to you by Red Clover Advisors. We help companies to comply with data privacy laws and establish customer trust so that they can grow and nurture integrity. We work with companies in a variety of fields, including technology, e-commerce, professional services, and digital media. In short, we use data privacy to transform the way companies do business. Together, we're creating a future where there's greater trust between companies and consumers. To learn more and to check out our best-selling book, Data Reimagined, Building Trust One Bite at a Time, visit redcloveradvisors.com. We're very giddy today.
Well, I guess it's because we're back at the broadcasting business.
We are. We took a long turkey break.
It is.
And now we're back. And so for anyone who is curious about the U.S. state privacy party that is happening, we have just the guest for you today, because we have Andrew Kingman, who specializes in privacy technology and cybersecurity issues in all 50 states at both the legislative and attorney general levels. As a public policy advocate with experience in compliance, he brings a unique and substantive perspective to discussions on how best to increase consumer privacy protections while maintaining operational workability and cybersecurity protections for businesses. He is a nationally recognized thought leader in the field, and in 2020, he was one of 25 attorneys named to Massachusetts Lawyers Weekly Up-and-Coming Lawyers list. Well, Andrew, we are delighted that you are here today, and we're excited to get started.
Thank you both so much for having me.
That's your cue.
It's my cue?
That's your cue.
Okay.
In show business, there's like different cues.
Well, I'm oblivious to half the things I'm told by certain people.
Mm-hmm.
But having said that, Andrew, tell us a little bit about how your journey got you to where you are today.
Yeah, I don't know. Does anybody know how their career unfolded? I always say there's I don't know if you guys are fans of the Eagles, but there's this great documentary on the Eagles. And Joe Walsh, who's the guitarist, has this great quote. He said, he goes, "There's a philosopher," and it's definitely not a philosopher, who says, "As you live your life, it appears to be anarchy and chaos and random events smashing into each other and causing this situation or that. And then this happens, and it just looks like what in the world is going on. And later you look back at it, it looks like a finely crafted novel, but at the time it don't." And I feel like that's kind of my career in a nutshell. But, I got my start working in state politics and on state campaigns for state reps here in our fair Commonwealth of Massachusetts, and worked on a governor's campaign, went down to DC, but worked for a state government affairs firm there. Went to law school, decided I was leaving politics behind and state government behind. I was going to go be a corporate litigator. Did that for a couple of years and decided I was not going to be a corporate litigator. And then got back into the politics world. Like Michael and the Godfather, I got pulled back in here. So, I started after law school. When I went back to politics, I started working for AT&T and working on their public policy in Northern New England. This was probably 2013, 14, 15, 16. So at that point, ISP privacy started to be a big issue at the federal level, and we started to see some state bills. And I got very interested in the privacy set of issues and kind of felt like that's where a lot of, kind of big existential questions were going to be talked about and decided. And Got the opportunity by my mentor, Jim Halpert, who is the namesake for the Office character, as he is more than happy to tell you. And he gave me an opportunity to work on this client, the State Privacy and Security Coalition, and kind of a perfect mix of working on privacy, but need somebody who knows how to walk the halls in state houses and talk to state legislators and lobby. And so it was really great. I took sort of a year-long sabbatical to go help TikTok start their state policy group in 2021 to 2022. And then when Jim went back to the White House to go serve in the Biden administration, he asked if I'd come back and take over running SPSC. And so I opened my own shop last year, Mariner Strategies, and help SPSC and a few other clients work on state cybersecurity and privacy issues in all 50 states.
And the work that state coalition does is incredibly valuable. When I started my privacy career, I had the great fortune of being able to participate in a number of those calls way back when, and tremendous work. So really grateful that it's continuing here today.
I think what I like about it is that, I like a number of things, but I think the group, first of all, is a really great mix of, the legal team and the policy team. So you're getting, here are compliance issues with this problem, right? There are plenty of other groups who are great at talking about the effects on the economy if a bad bill passes, or this will inhibit innovation. We really try to be substantive and operational in our critique. But the other thing I love is that we tend to try to be constructive. We're not the no coalition. We're the, if you're going to do this, let's help you get to yes coalition. And that tends to be more rewarding in terms of being creative, finding solutions to problems. We're more than happy to go and explain why BIPA is a bad idea. No, don't lose any sleep over that. But in general, the group started working on data breach bills way back in the, early 2000s, and has evolved to working on comprehensive privacy, children's privacy, consumer health privacy as of last year, biometrics, anything in that realm we're working on.
Well, 2023 kept you all really busy because there were a number of different laws introduced and then actually passed and signed. So we're curious, what are the biggest surprises in your mind from 2023?
Yeah, I think the biggest surprise was probably outside of the comprehensive world, the My Health, My Data in Washington State being passed with a private right of action and with the broad definitions. I think there was a general sense of disappointment among the business community that we weren't able to do more to curb what, I think will be a pretty problematic law to implement. And I think will, pretty fundamentally change the way that consumers are going to be using the internet in Washington State. And I think, in the comprehensive world, I think other folks may have been surprised that so many red states passed privacy bills, right? And we had 7 states, and right out of the gate, it was Texas and Indiana and Iowa and Montana, and then we had Delaware and Oregon, kind of pulling up the rear at the very end of session last year. That was not particularly surprising to me. Over the past 3 to 4 years, as we've seen, national dynamics around populism grow on the more conservative side of the aisle. There's sort of been this closed loop caring about privacy between the right and the left, where it's become a really bipartisan issue. So I think it was not particularly surprising to me, but I think for a lot of folks in the middle of session, when we were in April and it was like, oh man, is it just going to be red states this year that pass privacy bills? I think folks were, feeling a little bit surprised by that. So, we'll see what this coming year brings. I think it'll continue to be a mix of red and blue. But again, this is something that's a bipartisan issue. I sadly took the time to add up all of the votes of the comprehensive privacy bills from Virginia through Delaware this year in all of the chambers that those bills went through, and the final vote tally was 3,140 to 30. So, this is not a partisan issue. This isn't an issue where, there's only one side of the coin. And if there is, it's in favor of, finding that balance and that framework that can work for everybody, and put in some privacy protections for consumers and give them consumer rights, but preserve businesses' ability to keep innovating and to institute some norms in their businesses around privacy.
On the Washington health law that you mentioned, and you thought that there would be some real challenges for companies, can we dive a little bit deeper in that? As someone who's really intimately familiar with that law, perhaps you can share one or two of or three of the big areas that companies should pay attention to, or that you're seeing companies really discuss. Anything that you can offer, I'm sure our listeners would really value.
Yeah, I think there were three sort of, let's put the enforcement aside. I think, the issues on compliance are always exacerbated when you have a private right of action, right? Because you have to assume that it's, the compliance provisions are being thought of by trial attorneys and not an attorney general's office or folks with necessarily expertise. So putting enforcement to the side, I think, three issues that jump to mind that we worked on a lot. One was the idea of the definition of consumer health data, which right now and as passed is anything that could be used to identify anything about a consumer's health in terms of, vital signs, bodily conditions, or bodily functions, anything like that. And, we worked hard, but to no avail, unfortunately, to try to get some intentionality added into that, right? So that a business has to actually be using that information in order to fall within the scope of the act, that they actually be using information to make inferences about health, not just that information could be used to make inferences. So that's one thing that I think companies should pay attention to, is that this is a much broader scope than just, this is non-HIPAA health data, like running data or my heartbeat, my resting heartbeat or something like that. This, could be the clothes that you buy, the food that you're buying. I'm a type 1 diabetic, so theoretically any piece of food that I buy has a health implication, right? So I think that can be challenging. I think the second piece is that while the bill requires opt-in consent for collection of this data, and we didn't really have an issue at large with the idea that sensitive health data should be subject to opt-in consent. This bill defines collection as any type of processing of data. So really, it's consent for using this data at every stage. So at storage, for deletion, for any type of analysis that you're doing beyond collection. The definition of collection is any type of processing. So, the way that manifests itself on the compliance side, I think, is going to be very, very tricky. And then the third piece is that the definition of consumer includes anyone whose information is stored in Washington state. So you do not have to be a resident of Washington if you're a company and you have servers in Washington state and you're storing data from other residents and other parts of the country, but the data that you're storing could be considered health data under this bill. There may be some compliance obligations for you there. So, those are three things that we worked hard, and again, unfortunately, to no avail, to change, that I think, will have some pretty big compliance effects when the bill goes into effect this coming year.
Very helpful examples. Thank you so much for sharing.
So one question that I was thinking about was, as you talked about looking ahead to 2024, I'd love to get your view on handicapping how many more privacy laws get passed. And second is, will we get to 50 before we have a federal law on privacy? Because as you pointed out, in my world, there are 52 different breach notification laws in this country, including Guam and Puerto Rico, which is insane.
Yeah. I would expect, last year we had 7, feels like, somewhere around that number is probably fair to expect this year. Could be more, I would be surprised if it was less than, say, 4. Only because at this point, I think there is a framework that, some consumer groups have supported, that business is generally okay with. And again, it's a nice win for the legislators as well to be able to do something on privacy that's meaningful, and to generally have bipartisan support and not be I always joke that legislators, particularly 3 or 4 years ago, before there was really an established framework, they would file legislation, they'd file a privacy bill and think that they'd get visited by 3 or 4 companies. And, in January, they'd be looking like, W or Obama in their first term. And, by April, they'd look like those guys in their last term, right? They're gray and exhausted, and they've aged 10 years and 4 months. And, it tends to be a pretty tough slog because of the amount of stakeholders that are invoked here. I have bad news for you on the federal side, which is that, I don't think many of us who are working on the policy side see much of a path for federal privacy in the next year or two. I would not be surprised if we end up with a data breach like patchwork of privacy laws, where there's a general framework that most of the vast majority of states have adopted, and there are going to be some outlier requirements in each of those states, right? But that, to my mind, the more states that adopt a bill, the less likely that it is that the feds are going to be prompted to move, right? Because if there's sort of a default national standard, then that lets them off the hook a little bit for better or for worse. I think we'd all prefer a federal bill at this point.
I wanted to ask you a follow-up, which is,
Yeah.
We have a lot of guests come on the show, and question we sometimes get into is, for a state legislature, as you know, they may have a variety of different priorities. Privacy could be one. Something in agriculture could be one. Now, AI is coming onto the scene, the latest sexy thing in technology. Can you kind of give us a little insight into how these state legislatures weigh what bills they want to make a priority versus other bills that kind of languish in the background? Because isn't that kind of a roadmap as to how privacy became more of a front burner issue with all of the states that have passed privacy laws?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I'll give you the standard lawyer answer, which is it depends on the state.
How does that feel to get that back?
What do you mean? Yeah. I get that from you all the time, and you're not a lawyer.
I gave a talk at my high school a couple weeks ago on this topic, and one of my old teachers, I had asked a question. What do you think about privacy? What does it mean to you, right? And she sort of gave an answer that wasn't okay. And I said, well, that's good, but let's go a little deeper. And I got to say, this is so much fun. I get to finally be the one, you did this to me 20 years ago. Now I get to be like, well, let's draw that out a little bit. Let's tease out what you mean. It depends on the state. I think external events and what's kind of in the news determine a lot of what states think that they want to focus on. A lot of states have a biennium, right? A 2-year cycle. And for many states, one of those years is a budget year. And so oftentimes that year, they're much more kind of, blocking and tackling. How are we funding this department? How are we fixing our subway? Or, whatever the budget priorities may be. And then the other year is kind of, larger issue, less, budgetary focused. And so oftentimes in that session is when we're getting a lot of the activity. A lot of the states, sometimes we get questions from regulators, or advice we'll give about how to get a bill done, is to sort of say, a lot of times it's not a 1 year or one session thing. Most of the states that have passed comprehensive privacy at this point we're working at it for a few years, right? Texas, Representative Capriglione had filed bills going back to 2018. Obviously, we know Washington State never got their bill across the finish line. Both Indiana and Iowa took a couple years to do it. Montana had privacy bills for a number of years. So oftentimes it's a multi-year process, and through that process, legislators are able to kind of get the right pieces in the right places. I think the other thing that legislators have found success at is sort of outside of session stakeholder groups, where you're not getting, so much of state policy is made in such a condensed period of time, right? You've maybe got 4 months from the start of a session to the end of a session in most states. I live in Massachusetts, where we have a full-time legislature, but that's very much the exception versus the norm. So you have, kind of citizen representatives coming in and trying to handle very complex issues in a very condensed period of time. And, having that off-season stakeholder group where you've got some consumer advocates and you've got some business representatives, et cetera, being able to have those discussions without the crush of session and the pressure of session, I think tends to lead to more success. So I'm not sure if that totally answered your question, and I'm happy to dig into it more. But I think the more patient that legislators are, actually, the faster that can happen.
Well, it sounds to me like you made a couple real important points. One is the legislation that we see get passed is usually the effort of being a kind of a privacy seedling legislative effort that grows into actually getting passed. And I guess the other interesting thought is for the laymen, or even Jody I who participate in the space, what level of understanding? I mean, I'm sure you've seen some of the congressional testimony big tech gives up on Capitol Hill, and all the media talks about is how silly some of the answers are. Because, let's be honest, the US Senate's kind of like our old person's retirement home with the average age. So I was just curious, on a state level, do you find engagement and thoughtfulness amongst the legislators, or at least their staff, are being pretty savvy and understanding these issues?
Yeah, I mean, I think the vast majority of legislators are working really hard to understand this stuff, right? And again, it is not easy when you are coming in for 4 or 5 months at a time and trying to get your arms around this. And when our advocacy is really like, well, that's not really how like a deletion right is operationalized on the back end, internally, or like, here's why authenticating a consumer request is actually much trickier than you might think it is. I mean, yeah, of course, that stuff is hard for them to grasp onto and put it into the larger context. But I think the vast majority of legislators, I mean, one of the reasons I love working at the state level is there is still that altruism, right? I mean, you have to have a degree of altruism to get paid $500 to go get yelled at for 5 months by constituents and lobbyists and go to the rubber chicken dinners and do all of that work, right? You've got to want to do it. And so, I find that the vast majority of legislators are doing it in good faith and want to get to the right answer and are really trying to understand the issues. Obviously there, of course you see exceptions to that, but overall, I think it's a pretty good faith effort all around to try to, get to yes and get to something that works for everyone.
What are you hearing from the regulators? So once these wonderful legislators pass their legislation, now we have regulators who are going to come in and try and say, companies, make sure you're doing X, Y, Z. Are there any big themes that maybe aren't making the headlines that people can be aware of?
That's a great question. Are there big themes? I think one of the things that we're going to be continuing to push back against this year, unfortunately, some of the federal dynamics are coming into the state dynamics, where you're seeing a bit more polarization, and you're seeing, kind of politics over policy sometimes. I think one of the things that became clear last year, in particular, is that privacy is starting to become a place where larger cultural issues are getting hashed out, right? So state privacy legislation, does sensitive data cover reproductive health care information, or what is the ramification of biometric data? We don't want a surveillance state type of concern. We're going to see it, and are already seeing it in AI, where some blue states are really looking at, hey, we want to prevent systemic and disparate impact and discrimination. Some red states are more concerned about, we want to make sure speech isn't suppressed, and algorithms aren't prioritizing particular types of speech over another. And so, I think we're going to continue to try to keep the focus on the substantive and operational parts of privacy law, and make sure that it works and is kind of, to the extent possible. I mean, we very much understand that, any legislation is going to reflect that state's cultural values. And so we get that, but trying to keep the compliance obligations at least out of the, cultural, circle, or the cultural, kind of cauldron there.
Kind of speaking, you brought up the topic of, as my mom was calling it, the IA.
Be nice.
She called it, which is so funny. Anyway, when we're talking about AI, I actually read the CCPA AI regulations that were drafted and came out last week. And thought I had is, as I said earlier, you have all these competing priorities for legislation. Do you think we might see a trend where AI legislation gets bootstrapped into privacy legislation, or do you think it will be something separate? Because I'm thinking, as a policymaker, you have to have a strategy around, hey, they've got 4 months of time, they've got a finite attention span. What is the best way forward to do that? Or to end up, if I do both, hey, it's just a watered down bill and I've really accomplished nothing.
Yeah. Well, first, my joke that I've been making, that I'm putting out on this podcast, because I know everybody in privacy listens to this podcast, is that I think the IAPP is going to be changing its name next year to the AIPP, based on they've been focusing on AI these days. And that's trademark. Nobody else can use that, or just. But no, yeah, I think privacy is very AI adjacent, or vice versa, right? And so I wouldn't be surprised. I think one of the things we're going to see in any kind of emerging tech legislation moving forward is sort of the primacy of the data protection assessment, right? And that's going to, with whatever type of new technology that's going to emerge, having some internal documentation where you're weighing the risks and benefits. Issues around disclosure and transparency are going to be there in AI. How much, of a company's data set do they have to make transparent? How much of their methodology, those types of things. So I think many of the issues are going to be the same. I don't see it being bootstrapped too much to privacy. I would note, like you, with interest, that the California Privacy Protection Agency has noted that they are the de facto regulator of AI in the U.S. going forward. That was a quote that they put out this past summer. So I was not aware that was what the CPRA had done, but that was surprising. Beyond California, I think that's, if we're talking macro trends, that's kind of another interesting point, right? That California is a little bit on an island. And I think what they do obviously has huge import on the compliance side, because they're the world's fourth largest economy. And so many businesses have major operations and offices there, but nobody else is really following what they're doing, right? Everybody else is kind of doing it a different way. Nobody, although the CCPA had been filed in a lot of different states, nobody else adopted that. I think other states have been pretty wary of getting in the rulemaking world. We've seen obviously Colorado go down that path. But otherwise, nobody. I don't think any of the other states have rulemaking in there. So, I don't know. We're certainly going to see a lot of activity in AI this year. I think there are some trends that are starting to emerge. Whether we see it bootstrapped on the back of privacy or worked into a comprehensive privacy framework, not clear.
We're gonna have a lot of crystal balls. We have the AI crystal ball, the privacy crystal ball. There's gonna be a lot of crystal balls. With so much knowledge in the privacy space, we always like to ask, what is your best privacy or security tip?
Yeah, I mean, to me, going back to the data protection assessment, I would say if your company does not have a process established for that already, I would get on board with that because as I said, I think whether it's privacy, whether it's AI, whether it's children's privacy, that is going to be, I think, a central component of any compliance regime moving forward. And I think any of us who have either advised companies or worked in companies who are working on data protection assessments, it's a huge process to put together, of course, across all of the business units. But we're just seeing it, to your point, with the CPPA. They explicitly call for a cross business unit group for their risk assessments, right? And to the extent where if you're doing high risk processing, you have to explain why you didn't consult external experts. And so, I just think that to me is going to be a central part of any privacy compliance program going forward, or any AI compliance program going forward. And the more you can start building into that and normalizing that now, I think is probably for the best and is a good investment long term.
There you go. DPA Central.
I was hoping he was going to say know your data, and then we could have that red Clover T-shirt for our guests.
Well, you could have DPA and know your data.
There you go.
I think, listen, if you haven't done data mapping yet, then good luck to you because as a company, because if you don't know by now where your data is coming from, what you're doing with it, and where it's going when it leaves, it's going to be tough. You're going to spend a lot of money on Red Clover and Mariner and other companies to help get you.
But you have to maintain it. Even if you do it once, you got to keep maintaining it because someone else in the business is doing something cool and interesting.
I think those initial compliance costs are going to get steeper and steeper if you're falling behind.
I agree. What he said.
Wow. Or you can just pay me on the back end when I clean up your breach. Yeah. Or if it can be
trying to make sure, as I said, we're trying to make sure your billables get.
So, when you're not doing all of your public policy making stuff in state legislatures for privacy, what do you like to do for fun?
Yeah, well, golf is my addiction, and like legislation, it is incremental. It is a masochistic undertaking that we only get for 6 months at a time up here north of Boston. So that's what I love to do. Love to travel and play golf. I love to spend time with my family. In the summer, we try to get out on the water as much as possible and take a breather and try to regroup from my hairline receding at a 4 or 5 month increment.
Well, we're so grateful that you came and shared all this amazing wisdom with us. If people would like to learn more and follow you, where should we send them?
Yeah, you can go to www.marinerstrategies.com. I am on whatever the platform is being known as now, at Andrew K 2342. Might be X, it might be Twitter. I don't know. It might not be here by the time this podcast airs. Who knows? But you can find me there and on LinkedIn. And we love talking to new clients. My associate and I really enjoy this work and find it very, very rewarding to help solve companies' problems and try to help them plan for what's coming next. So thank you guys for all the work that you do. and for the opportunity to be here.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Thanks for listening to the She Said Privacy, He Said Security podcast. If you haven't already, be sure to click subscribe to get future episodes and check us out on LinkedIn. See you next time.